All right, everybody, welcome to the show. Look, it's been a crazy week. I normally have shows on like Monday and Tuesday. We didn't do that this week because the sun is out, the weather is fantastic, and it was just yard work week. And boy, did we ever get a lot of yard work done. An arbor here, and still so much more to do. But that is why we're kind of doing a combo, because normally I keep the paranormal separate from the political, but we're kind of doing some UFO mixed with a little light politics and conspiracy today. I have Dr. Dean Bertram here. I'll do an intro in about a few seconds, but before I get into that, remember to subscribe, whatever platform you're watching this on. We've got the new Rumble channel. Got 33 big subscribers now on Rumble. So you guys can go check that out. It's Gen X on X on Rumble, where we're streaming all the stuff. Please subscribe there. I'm trying to get away from YouTube. We are streaming on YouTube. So I've got quite a few subscribers on the Ghostly Archives channel there. I love it that you guys come, but YouTube is really peeving me off. And so many people are getting the shaft from a platform that the people really built up in the first place. So it's unfortunate. Anyway, so follow us on Gen X on X on Rumble. Be sure to share the content, give a thumbs up or a heart, whatever it is. Put it on your watch list. All this interaction, comments, questions helps the podcast grow. It keeps it lively. And if you're listening to this on the audio podcast platform, 5 stars, because it helps us show up in those charts on like iTunes and all that stuff. So don't forget. And if you have friends with podcasts, I keep saying this, support your friends, share their stuff, like their stuff. Now, my guest today, Dr. Dean Bertram, we're going to be talking about this, well, maybe the CIA, maybe we'll get into Mossad, because I'm sure it's a whole bunch of intel agencies and how they pretty much play a hand in Hollywood and the film, especially concerning UFOs. I mean, they do it in all sorts of areas, but specifically UFO, not USO. UFO. So my guest, Dr. Dean Bertram, he graduated with a PhD in American Cultural History from the University of Sydney in Australia. His dissertation, guys, was on flying saucer culture, a historical survey of an American UFO beliefs, traces and examines the developments of UFO belief within the context of American culture. And since we know most intel agencies run our countries, this is a good topic to go into. So I hope you guys enjoy this. I'm not going to leave it off too much longer. Let's bring Dean in. Welcome back, Dean. This is your third time on this
Wow.
rendition of my podcast.
I feel honored. Thank you for having me back, Melissa.
Well, a lot of people that I like to get new guests, but I like to have regulars keep coming back because it's like it gives people a narrative about UFOs or whatever it is. And there's some people you just get a good rapport with, and you do fantastic research, and you're like a plethora of knowledge, especially with UFO. So we're
Oh,
glad
thank
to
you.
have you back.
No,
Yeah.
it's great
So,
to be here.
well, UFOs. I wanted to kind of get this idea about, I don't know if you know how Intel runs and what level that it runs at in all the governments, but I have this idea that it's literally running the country. It's not really the government.
Yeah, I think obviously we've heard Trump talk about the deep state many times, and there's a sense that even outside of conspiratorial sense, there used to be this wonderful English show, which I don't know many Americans have seen. It was very popular in Australia, called Yes Minister. And then it became Yes Prime Minister as you followed this character. And he was originally a minister in the British government, and then he became the Prime Minister. But the whole running shtick of that show was it was essentially his bureaucratic advisors who manipulated him and ran everything. And so I do think often within government, there are people that are in positions of non-elected authority who sometimes remain in those positions throughout various administrations. So while the government can change at an elected level, the backbone of the day-to-day operations of a government clearly don't change that often. Sometimes, an incoming president will change the head of a department or something, but all of the other senior bureaucrats in that system remain forever. It's like Hoover at the FBI. How long was he the director of the FBI? For like ever, right? Until he died, I think. It was 40 years or something. I should know. I don't actually off the top of my head know the exact timeline, but he was head of that department for that agency for decades and decades and decades. So when you have people in those kind of positions, then what you said is absolutely correct. People often with their hands, who have their hands on the levers of bureaucratic power, they aren't the people that you see getting up making campaign speeches.
No. And I was just watching Benny Johnson, and he was covering a lot of the stuff that's coming out in the Trump cases, and that they know that Biden sent out a lot of the FBI and all the stuff, but all these intel people, they were positioned all over when Trump got in. And it's just horrible. And that's not a surprise. It's not called the swamp for no reason. But I also was reading right on Twitter. It was the most shocking. I'm not surprised, but I'm still disgusted and shocked. Some journalists, they were keeping it low key, but they were talking about how they had interviewed people who had to make certain decisions. They were literally like, their family were told they were going to be murdered or whatever, and they were filming them unless he raped like a little, can't say
what
this
on earth?
RP a little boy, and they film it and they use it against them for propaganda. Is this true? I don't know. They were making some pretty crazy claims that people are making these decisions because they have weird sex stuff, or they're forced to do things and filmed with like at gunpoint, and if they don't make certain decisions, their families are like dead, and they'll make it look like a suicide or an accident.
I do think the idea of people being compromised and then used is probably very true. I'm not sure to what extent, but certainly the whole Epstein story is probably just the top of a very dark swamp where these type of operations are
Have you
probably
seen this stuff
designed to
about P. Diddy?
compromise. I'm
Have you?
conscious of it. I haven't been tracked. I'm aware of the story, but I haven't
Oh,
dug deep. But
it's twisted. It's twisted. And the FBI, everyone's like, the FBI is going in. I'm like, they're going in to get rid of evidence. That's what they're going in to do.
well, I think that's and funny. I know we're not talking about UFOs right now, but I think that's part of in a way, the UFO narrative as well, regardless of the involvement of intelligence agencies, and there clearly is, incidentally, I'm not saying there isn't. I think what you just said then regarding the FBI going in to perhaps destroy evidence, regardless of whether it's true or not, it very well could be, I have no idea, but the UFO narrative, I think, has become so popular in some ways because a big part of that narrative is the government knows the secrets and won't tell them to us, because there has been a genuine shattering of any kind of trust in the powers that be, and that allows things like UFO belief to go in very conspiratorial directions. Because after things like, I don't know, let's pick something, after Watergate, for example, if you look back in the past, or after the type of the Russia collusion gate we saw, manufactured around Trump, or I mean, you can look at so many different examples. People don't trust the government, and well, in fact, there's a very good UFO example: the Condon Committee, which was the University of Colorado's study into UFOs. They were employed by what was kind of palmed off to them by the Air Force, who were the primary investigators of UFOs in this country in the late 60s, under congressional pressure. But the Condon Committee, while not governmental, it was certainly official. It seemed to have been so crooked that after that, the UFO community really couldn't any longer trust science or the government to give them the answers. Whether science or the government had the answers is another question altogether. But there's this way that we now look at institutions that traditionally people would have thought was a bedrock of America, i.e. the FBI, right? Back, love him or hate him, in the early days of Hoover, the FBI was seen as a paradigm of virtue. The FBI it's like Agent Cooper, right? Lynch's version of Agent Cooper, the FBI agent in Twin Peaks, who's all squeaky clean and Mr. Americana. I know it goes in some dark directions in the series, but the presentation of Agent Cooper in that is what the FBI used to be thought of in this country. It was thought of as this above reproach, apolitical organization that was all about, protecting America. But how many people look at any intelligence agency today and think that they have the best interests of the American public at heart? Whether they do or not, that's
Yeah.
up for debate.
Well,
But I don't think many
I
people
want
look at
to
them and feel that anymore.
make a bet that the FBI or any kind of agencies probably wrote that narrative about a squeaky clean, all
Oh,
American.
I'm sure.
I'm going to bet they had something to do with that, because I don't think there's ever been any kind of position that's ever been like that. They might want to present it, but I just find it impossible I just think they had something to do with that narrative on TV even.
You know what? I bet you have. I don't actually know. Although I should, because it's kind of it's not in my wheelhouse, but it's just a little off to the side. I wonder if all the type of the FBI type shows in the past, which were popular, on American television and in film, particularly in the early days in the 50s and the like. I bet you they had. I bet you they had support and access to the FBI, and this is something we're going to talk about today. We know that in Hollywood, if you're making a war movie, you want to get on board with, you want the government to, or you want one branch of the military to let you have access, because they can give you tanks and they can give you, extras, and they can give you access to, various, inside areas you couldn't just as a filmmaker. And so then in return, though, there's an expectation that you're not going to say bad things about them. So a lot of the big science fiction films, which have the military in them, like Transformers, or what is it, the Battle for Los Angeles, or those type of sci-fi films which have the military involved, the DoD came on board and gave those filmmakers access to all, everything that they wanted. But in return, it's really a recruiting film for the US military. And often the US military or the CIA, incidentally, forget about UFO movies for a minute. There was a CIA series back in the day. I'm trying to think what it was called. Shortly after 9/11, it was quite popular. But that was a CIA recruiting show, essentially. The CIA gave the producers full access to everything, but they wanted to present the CIA as this organization that was, above reproach and was good to join. And it's the same as most films which are made out of Hollywood, where the US branch of the military helped them. They're essentially recruiting films. But of course, the CIA have other missions as well, as do some other agencies. Sometimes there's a desire to present certain ideas, like present again, not talking about UFOs, who is the enemy of America that we're going to show in this movie? Who are the bad guys? Who are the good guys? How do the good guys act? How do the bad guys act? So there's a history. I mean, in Hollywood, there's a DoD office. I forget what it's called, but it's where they liaise like with Hollywood films. It's actually there in the center of Hollywood. I think even the CIA has one now, where they're in a building and you go and you liaise and you're a producer and you go there and you go, okay, I want to make this movie, and you want access to what they have. And so there has been a long history of that, going way back, obviously to World War II. If you watch, I mean, think of the Disney cartoons that were made, the pro-World War II movies back then. Disney worked hand in glove, for better or for worse, depending what your position is, with the US military in those days, making essentially American propaganda movies. And that tradition, it hasn't stopped. I mean, we still see it today when you see often movies are, and whether it bothers you or not, that's by the by. But military movies are often about, a recruitment video. It encourages you to see how brave the military are, and if you're 18 and you watch it with your friends, you get all G'd up and you go and sign up for the Marines the next day. I mean, literally, that's the surface level. You know what I mean? We're going to go deeper than that.
Top Gun, like Top Gun in the 80s.
Absolutely.
And they even did Top Gun recently, so I bet
it was a good movie, by
Tom
the way.
Cruise got a whole. He probably got, well, he did a good movie. It was pro-American, which is what people want to hear, right?
Yeah, I liked it.
But you can bet it has this whole idea where it wants the same thing. It wants people to be like, yeah, I'm gonna be like Tom Cruise.
Yeah, America, F yeah, I'm enlisting tomorrow. And
Fuck
I get
yeah.
it, of course. I mean, and I think that's the surface level. So I think we're probably going to go a little deeper with some of the UFO stuff. But I think the first thing to acknowledge is that Hollywood has been intricately connected with the military and with various agencies where there's nobody suggesting that they weren't. It isn't like this is conspiratorial to suggest, because they've got offices down, they've got offices around the corner from the studios to facilitate this. So
yeah. So I'm gonna comment here. I'll just do it before I get into the questions. Incognito says, pretty sure the CIA has been involved with Hollywood since the CIA was started, and Operation Mockingbird is the news media. Good point.
Sure. And before the CIA, of course, it was, I mean, that's just the agency born really after World War II. You can say there was the OSS and other agencies which were essentially doing similar things prior to the National Security Act being signed. Ed Schultz, I just saw, who's a good friend of both yours and mine in our shows, just mentioned that Stargate SG-1 worked closely with the Air Force. I didn't know that I'm not at all surprised, and I'm sure that's true. And that's how you get access. If I was going to make a movie tomorrow and I was in Hollywood and I wanted to have tanks and Air Force and access to Air Force bases, of course I'd go and knock on the door of the liaison office, which is downtown from my office, and say, hey, we want to make this movie. And then apparently they read the scripts and things. Like, you've got to present your script, and then they give notes. And so it's this effort, which it isn't just, sure, come in, do whatever you want to. We don't care what you're saying. There's a collaborative effort then when you make that deal.
So now, why would the CIA or any intelligence agency, why would they care about UFOs? If most UFOs might even be false, why would they have this narrative where they wanted to invest in this type of, to build a narrative about aliens or UFOs?
I suppose that's the most important question for what we're talking about today. Well, we know in the early 1950s, when the sources were relatively new. As far as a modern phenomenon, it really starts in about 47, although people can talk about things in World War II, like Foo Fighters chasing Allied planes and the like. But let's start in 47. This was a real issue for the military and for intelligence agencies. Although it was often downplayed in PR, we know that regardless of the reality of the phenomenon, we certainly know from the releases of multiple documents now that everybody was really concerned, from the CIA, the FBI, the various military agencies. Everybody was worried about what this thing was, right? And the CIA in the early 1950s conducted something called the Robertson Panel, which was to determine how this should be dealt with, the flying saucer phenomenon. Although while the panel kind of came to the conclusion, well, this isn't actually necessarily a genuine threat. What was a threat was the potential of excess reports about flying saucers tying up military interest and tying up communication lines, and the potential for it to be misused by as propaganda by an enemy of the United States, all of these kind of things. So the Robertson panel had a conclusion that what we need to do is demystify and debunk flying saucer stories going forward. So while there isn't necessarily a very good paper trail, and in his excellent book, Robbie Graham, who's now passed, unfortunately, Silver Screen Sources, he
Mhm.
talks about the CIA often not leaving a paper trail, for example, often doing a lot of work over the phone. Apparently, it's well known that they don't like to keep records of some things. So perhaps we might have a record of how some of this debunking and demystifying was carried out. You can certainly, though, look at some films and some stories which either downplayed or made the UFO story kind of ridiculous. But prior, perhaps we should rewind a little bit. But that answer your question might be why the CIA would want to use the media to spin the UFO story, or Hollywood or whatever, in a certain way. And we also know, of course, that the CIA, I think between the 1950s and up into maybe, I don't know, the 70s or 80s, they had something like 400 CIA agents who were actually card-carrying agents and or assets working for various major press organizations in the United States of America. And I'm not talking about necessarily a local little, I'm talking about NBC and CBS and ABC
Yeah.
and the New York Times and Reuters and AP. So they could control many narratives. And not to mention that often people who own these companies, to do either the patriotic thing or whatever, would say, if you got a phone call saying, hey, we don't want you to run this story, or hey, spin this story that way. Now, I'm not talking about UFOs in particular now. I'm just talking about general information
Right.
management by
Right.
intelligence agencies, that yes, they'd go, okay, we won't run this story because we've been told not to. So at that level, certainly in the media, we know through I think there were some congressional hearings and there was various investigations, and we know that figure's fairly accurate, that 400-esque that I threw out. And there's no reason to expect that there wasn't a similar, although there isn't a great paper trail, to be honest, that there wasn't similar involvement within Hollywood. And you can look at some of the early Hollywood alien invasion movies and see that there was very likely CIA and or military intelligence involvement. Perhaps one of the most
Mhm.
famous early science fiction UFO movies ever made, and perhaps the most influential, and perhaps quite frankly the best, was The Day the Earth Stood Still. Now, at all levels of the key creatives in that, there is involvement with various intelligence agencies. Daryl Zanuck, who pushed the film and was the studio head, was a well-known supposed CIA asset. The writer and the producer had both worked previously to working for the studio, had worked for, I think, the Army Signal Corps, but they were filmmakers. They were essentially in the propaganda units during World War II. The director, Robert Wise, claimed that during, I guess, pre-production and filming, he was visited by multiple government and engineer and scientific types from Washington who showed him information about UFOs that made him a believer. So Robert Wise actually believed in UFOs after having consultants from Washington come and show him all of this stuff. So that's one example of a film where you can see somewhat of it. You can certainly look at figures and hear testimony from people who were involved and think, okay, there was probably something going on here where it was being spun or directed in a certain way via perhaps the desires of intelligence agencies. And why that's important is The Day the Earth Stood Still really set the bar for flying saucer movies to come after it. That's a really significant early film.
That's interesting. And I know for a fact this is so they say that the CIA in specifics has a massive budget for film, like
I'm sure.
massive. So this idea that, well, maybe they do. I'm like, no, they have a massive budget. It's a part. And I was watching the interview that Tucker Carlson did with Putin and talking about propaganda, and Putin
Good
was like,
interview.
"Are you kidding me? That I'm paraphrasing, obviously. He says the West has some of the best propaganda in the world. Like
Oh,
you
yeah.
can't. He admitted it's hard to compete with that level of propaganda. It's made to look like entertainment, but yet I think they know they always try to say, "Oh, the films don't influence you. They don't influence how you think." If that's your parents' fault, music and film don't influence children, and that's BS right there. Because even if you think that it's a fantasy, it's still going to go in your mind. I think it goes somewhere subconsciously. And I've seen people say stuff that about conspiracy theory narratives, and I'll watch an old movie and there's the conspiracy theory. It's like a 40-year-old movie, and I'm like, oh my God, it's right here. Maybe they're even putting conspiracy theories out there
I,
in our minds, and then we think we
it's
thought of
quite
them
possible.
later.
Well, I mean, the culture is what I was watching. I was watching some, I don't know, I don't even know the name of the show. It was a show which looked at, I think Hollywood mysteries or something a while ago. It was at late at night, and I don't often have time to watch nonsense, but I was this night. And it was about who's that Fatty Arbunkle, that famous actor back in the
Yeah,
silent
silent
era,
film.
who got involved in this scandal that supposedly he potentially raped and killed this woman. And
Yeah,
it
it
probably
ruined
turned
his
out,
career.
yeah, and it probably turned out that it was all BS. But anyway, apparently one of the motives at the time by the prosecutors and other people who really wanted to put Arbunkle behind bars, and it sounds horrible, but in a way, when you look at the world now, who knows, maybe they were right, was there was this idea that Hollywood was promoting these contra-American and contra-Christian and contra-wholesome ideas, and if we can take Arbunkle down, if we can take the system down, Hollywood will collapse, okay? So at the time, the type of things that people who were criticizing Hollywood were claiming was poisoning Hollywood with the values was things like, I guess, lasciviousness and, drunkenness and, all the type of, drug use, sexual kind of, because a lot of this stuff was, I think, pre-code and I think there's a Fatty Arbunkle trial, I think, afterwards, which made them Hollywood tried to pretend they were going to self-regulate. And that's when they set up the Motion Pictures Association or whatever it is that did the
Yeah, yeah,
rating
yeah.
systems and everything. At any rate, there was an academic or an historian interviewed, and he said, of course, those values now that they were trying to stop, they are American values now, and it's probably because of Hollywood. And he wasn't saying it conspiratorially, but it's so true.
I think
The
that they are.
Because
I think
that's what
he's right.
everybody's, yeah, you're invested in that as, and I didn't escape it. Good grief. I mean, I've consumed Hollywood products my entire life. If that's
Yeah.
your culture, if your culture now is the type of isn't middle American standard old 1930s, square dance and church every Sunday morning kind of culture. If the culture you're consuming is, pop videos and films with people having affairs and people doing all of that, that's going to be the culture that you consume. So again, we're not talking about flying
Right.
saucers, but at the same time, even conspiratorially aside, back to flying saucers, perhaps one of the reasons people are so aware of I guess what I call modern. I even call it X-Files UFO belief for slang, because if you say that, you know what people mean. Like today, most UFO belief is X-Files UFO belief. It's the idea that the government had
Yeah.
secret deals with aliens and recovered a saucer at Roswell, and they've got underground bases and all of this kind of stuff. That that I suppose penetrated most people's consciousness who weren't already into UFO stuff by seeing films like Men in Black, by watching shows like The X-Files, by watching shows
Independence Day.
Independence Day. And it's interestingly, I think Independence Day is one of those movies which maybe the DoD refused, because it's interesting. There's a history of movies in the UFO realm that the DoD or various other government agencies helped or didn't help. And I think Independence Day might be one that they didn't help because
They
because,
didn't like the Capitol building
no, I
being
think
blown
because
up.
they didn't like the conspiratorial stuff that there was, there was
Um,
Roswell and apparently, like, I think Spielberg was helped on some films, but not others. For example, Close Encounters, he couldn't get, I think he wanted access to a National Guard unit or something, and they refused. NASA refused to help Spielberg on Close Encounters. Ironically, I think later they came on board for ET. But it's weird, there's these movies that they were involved with. Obviously, the ones which are like a lot of the ones, like I said, like Battle for LA or whatever that alien invasion movie is, and Transformers, because don't forget the Transformers are kind of, aliens
mm,
from outer space, even though they're robots. Those movies which presented the US military in very friendly lights and didn't have perhaps some of that UFO motif they normally get on board with, but some of the ones which seem to question the legitimacy of the American government keeping secrets or the history. I don't even, it is not the time for the discussion, but whether Roswell is real or not, certainly that apparently that portrayal about the US government keeping those kind of UFO secrets, that isn't the type of film that the DoD want to get on board with and open the Pentagon for you and throw, a battalion of tanks at you for the big action movie. So, I mean, it's just an interesting aside since we were talking about that stuff.
Well, and I know, like, if we go back, like, one of my favorite sort of sci-fi kind of fantasy films, I don't really call it a fantasy film, I would call it like an acid trip, really, honestly, was Stanley Kubrick's A Space Odyssey 2001.
So
And we
great.
know he was heavily involved with NASA with that film. But also, I can't help but think that Kubrick's involved with a lot of agencies for his films because he's allowed to take so long and he's got these budgets and his films don't always make a lot of money. But he's this great director and he has artsy films, and he can take all this time and he gets them made. And I'm thinking, now that I think about it, it wouldn't surprise me if he was, involved with multiple agencies doing his film.
He may have been. I know certainly that his daughter, today, who I think is to a degree a conspiracy theorist, and I don't use that as a derogative term. I saw a very interesting interview with her on the Alex Jones show on InfoWars, and the implication of what both her and Alex were talking about was that Eyes Wide Shut was because Kubrick had access to certain things and understood there was the type of sex blackmail type schemes we were talking about before used at high levels, and that there was influences of secret societies at high levels, and that, the rich were engaged in secret maneuvering, which perhaps wasn't on the front page of, various magazines. I do think, I used to know, I can't even remember, but I do think there was some stories about problems getting that film completed and getting that film out there
Well,
and the like. So
when they wanted Kubrick to edit, the studios wanted Kubrick to edit it down and he wouldn't. And then of course he died before it was released. So they stopped the releasal and the studio edited it and then released it,
there you go.
their
You know the
version,
story.
because he died before that happened. He had a massive heart attack, I guess, or something like that. Interesting, but it's
It is.
I mean, I've watched snippets of it. I think it's gross, but they actually shot that in in a in one of the mansions of what's not the Rothschild. I think they shot some of those scenes in a Rothschild mansion. So how do you get into a
Fascinating.
Rothschild mansion to shoot a movie scene? Come on now.
Yeah, that's pretty
crazy.
interesting. Yeah,
Yeah,
it
and then
is.
we have Ed Schultz reminding us about Kubrick and the fake moon landing.
That's a popular theory.
Well, I think if anything, it's not that they didn't land on the moon, it's that they weren't gonna give out their footage, and so they just told him to do some kind of footage to make it look like it, so they could hand it out because they were, like, top secret. They did not want to show their real footage. That's
Now
what
they
I
have a
think is the
movie about now,
likely scenario.
and Hollywood have just made a movie about it, right?
Did they?
No, I saw a trailer for it the other day. I don't know if it's out yet. I think Margot Robbie's one of the stars. It's literally about her being the PR person for NASA and them faking, in case it doesn't work, they're faking the moon landing.
Well, that's
Yeah,
interesting.
I saw the trailer the other day. I'm like, what on earth? Like, I wish I could remember. I should have jotted it down. Yeah, I don't think it's out yet. I think it's about to be, though. Like, it's very close to being released, I think.
Well,
Crazy.
so when it comes to, like, most of the stuff, like you mentioned ET, they're even talking about aliens and other life forms. Why would they are they doing it to prepare us for it, or are they doing it to make it look like it's silly? Like,
Mhm.
to make us feel like that's just silly for us to think there's aliens? Like, why do you think they would want to
That's a good question, and that's part of the problem of, I think, when you start to get into this type of, having to speculate on why and what they're doing and why they're doing it, because there's often theories, the idea that they want to debunk the type of the truth, and then at the other phase, at the other side, there's people saying they're trying to acclimatize us to get us used to alien life. Certainly, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, even though I mentioned before Spielberg was unable to have access to some of the things he wanted, NASA and National Guard stuff and other things, is there was multiple rumors circulating around that film that this was to prepare people for ET contact. That was a very popular theory. A more recent popular theory is that that actually demonstrated something called Operation Serpo or Project Serpo, but nobody started talking about Serpo until much later. And the story of that, and Richard Doty, who's I've actually had on Talking Weeds. I like the man, but he's certainly somebody. I mean, I personally like him. I get on fine with him, but he was an AFOSI agent, and he was behind the Benowitz affair, which is a whole nother story. But it's perhaps
Yeah.
the most interesting, if we were just doing a show not about Hollywood, but about psyops and about misinformation and the government playing with the UFO narrative. The Benowitz affair is probably, at least I think, the most interesting one. But there is, and it's actually shown in the wonderful documentary Mirage Men, where I guess Richard Doty is kind of the major character, but also the antagonist of that documentary, that allegedly it was Doty spinning that Serpo story even after.
Yeah.
And I had him on the show and I asked him on Talking With, he said, I had nothing to do with Serpo. I commented on it, but I did not originate it. But Operation Serpo, the theory is that there was a genuine exchange of, I think, 12 Americans went out into space with the aliens, just like the Richard Dreyfuss character does with the other people in the red or orange
Right.
jumpsuits at the end of Close Encounters, and the aliens left somebody behind, an alien behind with us. And so it was very much like a tale that, and supposedly, although this conspiracy theory didn't come out until after, a number of years after Close Encounters, that theory says that Close Encounters was actually a kind of, a documentary nod in that final scene to what had actually happened with Operation Serpo.
Interesting. We have a comment here from Incognito. He says, they are now trying to start the false disclosure narrative, possibly so they can trot out exotic tech as well as make money for the deep state and military industrial complex with their false invasion narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I suspect, and I don't know, again, it's very hard to say what the motive is for these things, but you can look at some things and be suspicious of the narrative. And I think that disclosure narrative is one I've always been particularly suspicious of. And ever since the New York Times story broke in 2017, which kind of legitimized again being able to talk about UFOs and a public platform, and all of a sudden all the media was talking about it and the government was talking about it, and you get real
Yeah.
DOD, press hearings, and then you get congressional investigations, and then you get whistleblower investigations, and on and on and on. I suspect all of the release of that information, whether it's true or whether it's partly true or whether it's all BS, whatever it is, has been very intentionally released through channels that you can look at and you can go, oh, it's interesting. The journalist who wrote the story about there being a secret DOD program and the Tic Tac videos on the front page of New York Times is the same journalist who wrote the first article about David Grush coming forward as the whistleblower. Like, it's just like there seem to be these avenues which have been, and
It's orchestrated.
yeah, it just seems to me that it isn't actually people, battling to get the truth out like a traditional whistleblower. Traditional whistleblowers, as we know, like Snowden, have to flee, so they don't get
Yeah, they have
killed
to
or
go
put in
live in
jail for
Russia.
life. They're not
Yeah.
rolled out in front of Congress, that's
Well,
my
that's
theory anyway.
I know somebody that I'm not going to say his name. He's a real freak. He constantly goes on Twitter saying I'm a whistleblower. I'm a whistleblower. I mean, he makes stuff up. He makes all his UFO stuff worked for Apple. It's all made up, all fictional BS. Totally. And he'll tell everybody he's a whistleblower. I'm like, if you were a whistleblower, you wouldn't be on Twitter going, I'm a whistleblower. I'm a whistleblower. He's not a whistleblower. He's a dude who lives with he's 60 years old, lives with his mom, and works at a grocery store. But you see him all the time lying about all
Oh,
his
good grief.
involvement and all his importance. So there's crazy people like that out there trying to grift off of UFO research
I'm
and
sure.
feel important because the word whistleblower makes them feel like they're special.
We just had a comment too. I'd like to just mention it quickly. Jerry Cthulhu said Greg Bishop on his Radio Mysterioso show, which is excellent, has some really good interviews about Benowitz. Of course, Greg Bishop wrote the most important book, I'd argue, almost ever written in the UFO field. It's a book I always recommend to people, and that's Project Beta, and that's about the Benowitz affair. That's about Richard Doty. He also was the major consultant, I believe, for the documentary Mirage Men, which I recommended earlier. So anybody who wants to really look at a specific military intelligence psyop spin, which it still affects what people believe about UFOs, dating back to the late 1970s. They should either read Project Beta by Greg Bishop. Again, it's one of my favorite UFO books ever written. Or if they don't want to read the book, go and watch Mirage Man. I think it's on Tubi and it's probably on
Mhm.
Amazon Prime. I think I even saw it for free on YouTube. It's all over the place. People should watch Mirage Man. It's one of the greatest documentaries about UFOs ever read. And if they want even more data, read Greg Bishop's spectacular book. So thanks for reminding me about that, Jerry Cthulhu, because yeah, Greg Bishop's one of the greatest researchers, maybe the greatest in the UFO field in recent times.
Now we have an interesting one, another one of my favorite ones. Fun side note, total different. The movies Alien, Blade Runner, and Predator all exist in the same fictional world. Writers connected all three. It's kind of interesting because you get those films where we're actually explorers out in space and we're like lunch. And it's like scary.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a horror movie in space.
So,
I wonder, yeah, I wonder who's involved with that.
who knows? Jerry Cthulhu just said Greg's done some excellent work, and he also mentioned reframing the debate, which was actually Robbie Graham, who's now passed, put that book together.
Yes.
It's excellent, also, but Greg Bishop has a piece in that where he talks about co-creation theory, which is it's one of the greatest journal pieces or articles ever written on UFO belief, about how perhaps whatever the other is, whether you want to think of it as extraterrestrial or spiritual or something else, whatever it is, we might be forming the reality of it somehow, human
In our
consciousness and
minds.
it interacting,
Right.
like our perception or our expectation interacting with us. So yeah, that book's totally worth reading as well. It's a great book.
Well, that's the thing is how will you know? I think that's why there's this one theory where everything's the same because we're creating it kind of idea. But although I like to think that there's variations in real things in different things, and I've had paranormal experience where I do believe that whatever was alive that had just passed was actually there. It was really compelling. I'm not going to get into it, but I don't
Hmm.
I don't know if I buy that everything's the same, like
I,
all
I,
one. I think there's variations, and
maybe.
that's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, nobody's an expert in any of this stuff. It's all just supposition and guesswork, really. There was
Yeah.
another movie I thought we probably should mention by a filmmaker called Robert Emenegger, and it was you can watch it on YouTube actually for free. It's called UFOs Past, Present, Future, and that's an interesting doc. I mean, the documentary itself's worth watching. It's narrated by Rod Serling and I think Burgess Meredith. I haven't seen it for a couple of years. It's great though, more than probably a couple of years. I probably haven't watched it for 10 or 20 years. But the
Mm.
background of that story is even more fascinating. Emenegger himself had a background in I suppose, in a way, intelligence kind of. He'd written his thesis at UCLA on the influence of media in public behavior. And then he went on to work for the United States Information Agency, which has now changed and it's merged with another agency, I think. But it's ostensibly a propaganda agency. Anyway, he was supposedly approached. In fact, his producing partner supposedly had all these contacts with the CIA and FBI and other agencies, but he was encouraged by the Air Force in the early 70s to make a documentary about UFOs. And he was given the doors open to him to the DOD and he got all access to all kinds of things. But what he was promised was a piece of film or a roll of film which showed a UFO landing at Holloman Air Force Base and a face-to-face meeting with people from earthly representatives, I guess, or military representatives with extraterrestrials. And he was promised he was going to be given this footage. And so he made the whole documentary. It's a good documentary, again, based on the fact he was going to get this secret piece of footage. And at the last minute, supposedly, the doors were closed and they said, we're not going to give you the footage. So the film itself has a kind of a reenactment animated thing. But supposedly there are a couple of frames in that film which show the actual UFO in the sky. But it's an interesting story because there's been other ones like it. There's been times where I think Disney back in the day, supposedly, I think Robbie Graham talks about it in his book I mentioned before, Silver Screen Sources, that supposedly Disney, even before then, had been promised they were going to be given some real UFO footage for a documentary that they were making. And when that footage got pulled, Disney kind of canned the UFO piece that they were doing. But there's been often those type of stories of about somebody about to be given, the keys to the kingdom and given this evidence, and it gets the community excited, and it gets film producers sometimes actively making movies. I mean, Robert Emenegus, he finished that movie. It's not like he walked away and didn't complete it. He just never got the footage that was promised. But those kind of stories still float around, in the UFO community. The idea that is real footage of this, or the idea that one day they're going to open up, and I think in many ways, like, I don't suspect the US government really have crash sources or alien bodies or anything else, but I can see the value in that belief system circulating, and not even necessarily for American citizens, but for for foreign governments. Oh, supposedly the US government has flying saucer technology. Like, and that might even be the reason, but it's a
Right,
potential
right.
reason. I think that's something we've got to think about. And that's something Greg Bishop's talked about at a number of places as well. And what's his other book? It's a collection of articles. I forget the name now. I'll probably remember the second
What
it's finished.
about what about the idea that the U.S. government and the CIA, they're creating these narratives as sort of a to distract people from actually looking into projects they're actually doing,
Mhm,
like to protect
definitely.
their own military, to protect their own high class information they may not want some other government knowing. They want the better military technology. They don't want people to know they have a certain aircraft or
Mhm.
some kind of laser beam. Who knows?
Well, we know that for a fact is the case. This is something we do know. It was when I was doing my PhD back in the 90s. Maybe it was already out just before, but it was around that time. And a CIA historian, meaning an historian employed by the CIA, not somebody writing from the outside, somebody actually within the CIA, wrote a piece about how I think the CIA back in the day had estimated something like 60% of sightings of genuine things that couldn't be explained. In other words, not Venus or not, swamp gas or not something like that, were actually US citizens misidentifying secret test planes like the U-2, for example. And the CIA were happy to spin that narrative because it's far better that a story on a local newspaper says, farmer sees flying saucer than farmer sees state-of-the-art US spy airplane. And I think that's probably been the case through a lot of things, like a lot of the things like triangular shaped crafts, which people seem to see all the time in the 90s and the late 80s, could very well have been, and I know some people have said they were things that we had and that we were testing. I think even at more mundane levels, like if you look at Area 51, it's much better to have a narrative that the US government is testing secret crashed sources there, and that's what people are seeing, lights in the sky, than it is to say, well, that's our new, stealth drone or something. And then it also kind of distracts from any genuinely unconstitutional or irregular things going on. Like Area 51 had this massive legal case brought against, I think, by workers who'd been involved in open pit burning there, I guess asbestos or similar type things, and got really sick in the Area 51 area. Like essentially malfeasance as far as treating your workers like illegally and having them do this horrible work. But nobody thinks of Area 51 where there were those kind of government abuses. They think, that's where the sources and the alien bodies are kept. That's where Bob Lazar was doing his stuff. So
Yeah.
it's easy when that becomes the story around a secret space, then perhaps other more down to earth and even in some ways more disturbing stories just get swept under the rug and get forgotten about.
Yeah, and I always find it interesting, like that people think they're going to find all the evidence of this stuff. You need the evidence, you need and I know that's what you need as a journalism. I know that's what you need in court. Like these people would need this evidence, but I always say to people, like, do you honestly think the government is going to leave the evidence? I mean, just in the J6 trial, that fiasco that we have going on in this country, they're like, whoops, we lost it. We don't know where it is. It's gone. China, like, oh, whoops, we accidentally fed all those documents into a paper shredder. We don't know what happened. I'm telling them, I'm like, you guys are naive at best if you think you're going to find the evidence you need and someone is not going to erase it off the internet
Mhm.
or light it on fire or lose it or raid your
Mhm.
house and steal it. It's like, yeah,
Yeah, and there's a great irony too, I think, in the UFO community in that it traditionally hasn't trusted the government to tell it the truth since the days Donald Kehoe was writing his books back in the early '50s, right? The standard narrative throughout UFO belief has been the government is lying to us and, da, 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 da. But it's so weird that the expectation is that this whole egg will crack the moment the government gives us the information. Like, you haven't trusted the government for 80 years. If they tell you something now, you're gonna go, "Finally, I believe this story." Like, it just seems it seems this ridiculous way to think that the UFO mystery is going to be solved, to look to the party that you haven't trusted for, like, literally 8 decades, to all of a sudden give you the answers to to
yeah.
the great cosmic mystery.
Exactly. And they have so much power now and they're so infiltrated with all the technology that they don't even care if we know that they're destroying this. They don't even care. They're just like, whatever. We'll just create our own narrative and keep going. You can't get more narcissistic than that. Like, that is pure narcissism. Ignore what is. Here's our narrative. We don't care what you do now because we got all the powers and keep going. And I mean, that's where we're at with the
Mhm.
government, the CIA. They don't care.
No. And Ed
There's
Schultz.
enough people that believe them.
Well, yeah, that's all you need. You only need to, I think, have enough people who will watch CNN or, MSNBC or any major network and just assume they're being told the truth. And that goes back to the days of Walter Cronkite. People would just believe, and then it was probably more of the public that would believe everything they saw on the nightly news.
Well, I
Perhaps we're
think a lot
lucky
of
today and
baby
less people
boomers for
believe.
sure do.
They still do today. The boomers still
Yeah,
do. I mean, God bless them, but they
yeah,
still do. They can't. It doesn't matter what network is the one they subscribe to. They're just going to believe everything that comes across that television as just verbatim truth. I think Gen X onwards is a little bit more suspicious. Sometimes, not all Xers and not all
yeah.
millennials, because Lord knows I know enough who aren't suspicious of the traditional narrative. But I think maybe then there started to be people who started to question a little bit more what perhaps they were being fed by, the mainstream machine. I just quickly I saw something interesting that Ed Schultz wrote. He said, just jokingly, "Hey gang, let's unite the world against a common foe." And he mentioned Outer Limits, Architects of Fear, which is a famous episode of Outer Limits, which suggests that by using a presented alien threat, you can somehow get the world to come together. That was also the major plot line of the Watchmen, not the Watchmen film, which changes, but the original Alan Moore Watchmen comic had the
Mhm.
idea that you could fake a UFO or fake an alien attack, and that would unite the world. Perhaps even more relevantly, is Ronald Reagan in a number of speeches said, "Imagine if we were all of a sudden faced by a threat from outside, this Earth, from an extraterrestrial menace. The whole Earth would, unite and come together." And so you bet your bottom dollar, not just because of the messaging in science fiction films, but if the president of the United States is delivering speeches to the United Nations and other places with that rhetoric, there is no doubt that at least some intelligence agency is going to be playing, wargaming that idea. Hey, what would happen if we made the aliens come and invade? Would we unite the world? So there's no doubt that when it's being talked about at that level, what Ed Schultz suggested has probably actually been war gamed. Incidentally, there's a book which most people say is just a kind of conspiratorial hoax called Report from Iron Mountain, which is
Mhm.
essentially this supposedly secret report which suggests various ways to keep a continuance of government through various, crises. And one of the things just presented in that book in passing is, well, you could stage an alien invasion that would do it. So certainly people have thought about this idea of presenting a threat from outside to somehow either unify a country or unify a world, or to justify certain,
I'm
government
so
policy.
skeptical of that narrative. I watched COVID and we ain't uniting.
Mhm.
Anyway, I have a little clip that I'm going to play. It kind of talks about Hollywood and CIA. It's a part 2 of, oh my gosh, 25. We're only watching one part of it.
Wow.
So let's check her out. And it's Hollywood CIA connection. Now, it doesn't go right into UFOs, but I think it might give us a little bit of an idea. And you can comment on that, or anyone can post questions. Here we go.
Now we have to ask ourselves, who's influencing our content?
Is the CIA involved in Hollywood?
Yes.
So for the past 28 years, I've probably had one of the coolest jobs in the world. I was a professional stunt performer. I've worked with some of the biggest stars. I've got to be Batman. I've got to be James Bond. I've won World Stunt Awards. I am in the Screen Actors Guild. I'm in the DGA. I'm in the WGA. And last year, I got into the Academy, the Oscars. I worked my way up from being a stuntman to being a fight coordinator, to being a stunt coordinator, to being a second unit director. Action! First big job I get, I'm on Batman Forever. And I'm walking around set and I'm pinching myself. I'm looking over and there's Tommy Lee Jones, there's Jim Carrey, there's Val Kilmer, there's Drew Barrymore, there's Nicole Kidman. And I'm like, how did I get here? As I get up the ladder, I realize it's not what people think it is. It's an illusion. It is a complete illusion. I've seen things at parties. I've seen artwork. I've seen statues. I've seen things in some people's houses that just seem to be mimicking occult stuff I'm reading about. So I was like, maybe there is something to this. I got really scared because this was the first time in my life that I was having to question my own reality. I didn't believe I was getting the truth from CNN, MSNBC, Fox. I didn't believe any of it. I just wanted to read it, absorb it, and digest it, and trust what my gut told me I was reading. As I did my research, I began to understand there's a very small group of people that influence all the companies that we watch. So they used to call them the Big Six. But Disney just bought Fox, and Disney controls Marvel, and Disney owns Lucas Studios. So look at that giant audience right here. Say a small group of people control the narratives and the content that we all see on all the channels. It makes you feel like, oh, I have lots of choices, but you don't. Who's telling them what to put on those channels? Where does that lead?
Tonight, the FBI is on the case, and they are warning big companies in America to protect their data after a big Hollywood studio got hit by hackers and several blockbuster movies ended up online.
This is the first time the United States has accused a foreign government of a cyber attack against an American corporation.
Now we have to ask ourselves.
There we go. So that's interesting. That, I mean, it's this the concept of a stunt. Now, who knows? He could be put up to it by the CIA. Who knows what's going on? I mean, but there's this. I always had this idea that they kind of want to get us now, like the way the narrative's going now, to like this new world order, weird AI, transhumanism religion. More than aliens and UFOs. Personally, I think aliens and UFOs are just used as a distraction. But it's like it's showing you how, we have the illusion of choice.
Well, I think you definitely don't have any choice if you don't break out of the mainstream. I mean, whether you watch Fox or whether you watch CNN, it's just it's a different, varnish on the reality that you're still kind of forced to be locked into. I think that one of the great things about, and there's problems with the internet, and there's all kinds of problems, and part of it's the type of AI stuff you think. I think people so dependent and so wired into technology all the time is maybe the greatest existential threat we have, including AI, the things which change the way that we interact with each other, and ways that we consume data, and ways that we spend more time staring at a screen than we do talking to people. That is all, I mean, clearly, definitely problematic. But at the same time, at least the internet gives you the potential to seek out other media to seek out other opinions, perhaps easier, well, definitely easier than you could have 50 years ago. Like, where would you, I mean, I guess you would have subscribed to some weird zine, or you would have joined some strange
Mhm.
little political organization, or maybe there would have been some shortwave radio channel broadcasting weird stuff, but you couldn't just have, pulled something up on your computer. But I think because so much of it is almost like an audience cult anyway, perhaps it doesn't even really matter. Like, even if you're looking at things and, if you're still spending 10 hours a day or 5 hours a day staring at a screen, does it really
Mhm.
matter if you're
Yeah.
consuming, fill in the blank independent content provider here, or whether you're staring at CNN? It's still, maybe as Marshall McLuhan said, it's
It's
the
addictive.
medium is the message. The way what you're consuming is the message. So I don't know. It's problematic though. So maybe you're right.
Yeah.
Maybe UFOs and aliens are secondary to the type of technological AI type
I
issues.
I I think the whole just things evolve and they change and the goals change for each generation as well. We have to remember that. But I wanted to know, do you know what other intelligence agencies are involved in movies? Like, is Mossad involved in any type of Hollywood or their own film industry? Does this happen in other countries as well to
I
the level that it does in the United States?
I mean, that's a good question. To be honest, just to put it up front, I actually don't know because I'm an American historian, so I spend most of my time
Right, right,
looking at
right.
this country. That said, I would assume that other countries' agencies were interested in what that country's media put out. Now, certainly, there obviously McCarthyism in America in the 1950s, and even earlier, there were Red Scares in America. There seemed to be a suggestion that there were people operating, and some of it was overblown madness, but some of it was real. I mean, there was concern that there were enemy interests in America interfering with or injecting ideological ideas into Hollywood films, right? And to Hollywood literature and Hollywood media and into rather American media and literature and other things. Certainly, you can argue today, I think, that if China is invested in a movie, or if an American company wants a big release in China, there's influence there. For example, the Red Dawn remake, which came out, about 9 years ago now. So everybody's seen, obviously, the first one with Patrick Swayze, and the Russians are invading with the help of the Cubans and others. And it's a great movie. I love that John Milius film. But the new one wasn't bad either, but it was ridiculous because who were the invaders? Ended up being North Korea or something. Totally, like, how on earth would they have the potential to invade America? But apparently it was Red China that were going to be the real bad guys in that initially. But there was pushback from China, so they rolled all of that stuff out. So in the end, China aren't the bad guys. I haven't seen, what's the movie with Matt Damon where he goes to Mars? Is it The Martian? Or I don't even know what.
Right, right,
I
right.
think
Yeah.
supposedly that had
Like Red
Chinese
Planet
influence
or
as well.
something.
Yeah, something like that. And then the Chinese
Yeah.
help in the end in that movie
So
or something. So I think there's a definite influence from financial investors, particularly
yeah.
if they're attached to a government
Well,
where it's like China, that has an
we
ideology push.
we have so many World War II narratives, and I'm not gonna get too political, but there's a narrative about World War II. And there's a really strong narrative about Holocaust and that. And we're barraged with that. And it always makes me think of there must be other things that have happened. And so I can't help but note that there might be some foreign agencies who might, for the establishment of their own agenda, are funding, because we know that Hollywood is run by a certain religion for the most part, that might be funding certain narratives. I mean, if you look at World War II narratives, I can't help but think like they want us to think this narrative and this narrative only. I'm not saying it's a lie, but I'm saying I think the victors write history, and there might be other stories or other things like that went on in World War II that we don't know about. And so here's a really interesting comment from Emily. She said Mossad is absolutely involved. Ghislaine Maxwell's father owned our school book publishing companies and the Sun tabloids. That's really interesting.
Mhm. No, I
Maybe,
think Emily's correct. I think that's the case as far as the influence of that family. But I understand what you're saying, but I'll say something which doesn't counter it, but gives an alternative twist on it.
mhm.
I do think that totalitarianism of any kind is anathema to my type of belief in an American republic and my belief in freedom.
Absolutely.
And whether that's Nazism or whether that's whatever. What is interesting, and I don't subscribe to the Daily Wire, but I saw the Daily Wire recently released a film, and as soon as I saw the trailer, I understood the point because it's so true. It's like the Nazis and the communists were both monsters. Then how come all we ever hear about is how evil the Nazis were, but we don't talk about how evil the communists were? And it's a good point.
I think I know why we don't talk about that.
Well, I think
I
why
won't
we don't.
say it on this show.
Well, why I think, and I will say why I think is that there's a political ideology that is reluctant to criticize the extreme manifestation of the political left, i.e. communism, and that many people with that political ideology, i.e. sitting to the left, have traditionally been in positions of power and influence in Hollywood and in the arts in general. Like there's a left leaning in the arts. I mean, it's obvious there just is. It's not me. It's not being conspiratorial. It's just the truth. So,
it's fact.
So we still, even during the Cold War, when there are clearly movies where the Russians were the bad guys, but for the most part, if you look at the crimes of history, were the Nazis horribly guilty? Absolutely. But were the Soviets just as horribly guilty and even in a longer throw? Absolutely. So it's interesting that you'll see. I remember when there was, all the kind. Well, there's still a culture war going on, but for a long time there was memes like, I saw them from people I know who are friends, like, "Oh, there's nothing more American than punching a Nazi." Well, I'm thinking, yeah, there's also nothing more American than punching a communist. If you look at the history of, the Cold War, but people don't talk about that. People don't talk about the threat that communism. Like Nazism may have been an existential threat for this small window of time. Communism was an existential threat that went on for decades and decades and decades afterwards. And arguably, if you look at Red China, it still is an existential threat. But we seem very reluctant to put communists as the ongoing cultural enemy. Instead, we talk about an enemy that was defeated back in the 40s. Still, it's very strange.
Yes. And I won't say it here. I put it in the comments. You can read it. But a lot of the Bolsheviks, who were the original communists, who went in and slaughtered the Russian royal family, were of a certain background. And I won't get into it. But people don't want to focus on that at all. They want to focus on Hitler. And the truth is that there's evil stuff going all over, and still to this day, with all different types of intelligence agencies. They have their own. I mean, they start all these wars that are starting right now. It's all for profit. It's all for money, and you can bet they're gonna. That the new movie that we just had about Top Gun was trying to pump up morale, because they knew this stuff was going to happen. That's why they're bringing everybody in this country, military age men. They know ahead of time, long ahead of time. CIA, all these people, they know Iran's going to happen. They know Ukraine's going to happen. They have it all planned in the bag. So long before we even realize what's happening, they've laid this out for decades.
I did like Top Gun 2. I did like Top Gun 2, though. I can't lie.
You may have, but they're probably trying to pump up young people to join the military, because guess what's going to happen? Guess what happened shortly after the original Top Gun? Probably Desert Storm. Like, just look at the long picture and what they're trying to encourage people to do. And and I mean, just recently for Daily Wire, firing Candace Owens for saying Christ is King, calling her an anti-you-know-what. It's getting ridiculous. You can't say anything. You can't even say, I'm proud to be a white Christian, because then you're evil. It's gone crazy. Anyways, that's way off topic of UFO, but it just shows you how they're rolling all these stuff out and planning them long before, so they can hype up the youth, hype up people. So we actually just go and be cannon fodder for them. Our sons go, oh yeah, I want to fight for my country. Woo! And it's all for money. All of it. And maybe even the UFO narrative goes into that. I don't know.
Maybe it's hard, though. I mean, this is going to sound brutal, but it's hard for me to imagine the age of the generation of guys who went and fought in World War II. From America or from Australia, where I'm from, those people were machines. I can't imagine guys who I'm sure in rural areas like I live, there are still guys who are like gung ho and hunt and would be formidable. But just as a general culture, it's not the same culture. as the people who signed up to go. Like, it's not, I just can't imagine the West putting together, if they had to really increase the breadth and the depth of the standing military. I don't think that we have a culture today which is spitting out men who are
No.
ready to go out and die on a foreign battlefield, who I mean, physically ready to go,
No, they're not. So when I was working in Care Aid, I had two different clients. One of my clients, he was 102. He was dying, palliative care. He was an ace pilot who shot down Nazis in World War One. And he didn't even know how to fly when he started this. He just joined the military and got in and learned how to fly a plane and got in and literally survived World War II shooting Nazis down. And he was a celebrated hero. My other client was would have been Hitler Youth. And he escaped the massacre that happened to German people after the war and came to Canada and with nothing and worked his way up to this massive company and gave to humanity and stuff. So I learned not to really judge everybody because like those Hitler Youth, they were brainwashed just the same as, any other country brainwashed their youth. So I found it really ironic that I had both on both sides as clients, and both have passed on now that, we're like, one was a war hero and one was a youth who was trying to survive after the war and escape and get away. It was really a kind of fascinating experience to look after. But they're a different breed in those days, that war generation, and then born during the war, and they're all dying. They're tough as nails. They had to be. They didn't have the same structure we have today that's sort of holding us up, actually, and we're all kind of stood on their shoulders. That's why I feel like everything could collapse now that they're gone.
You could be right. There's certainly, boys weren't spending all their time, not that every guy does this. I mean, I certainly know there are kids still playing sport and still hunting and doing all kinds of things, but for the most part, there's probably more kids plugged into video games than there are playing sport. There's probably more kids more interested in the social media than going out and hunting. Well, of course, in World War II, America, that's why the Americans were so successful in so many early, including from the War of Independence on up, because it was a nation of hunters and, people who were just hard men who were used to getting stuff done in the field, But today, they still exist in rural areas, but it's not a general. America then was the whole country was rural or semi-rural. Now increasingly in post-World War II years, the country became more and more urbanized, and that kind of reality is less and less for most of the for most of the population, to be honest. So, talking about World War II, though, I watched, this is a little off track, but gosh, it was fascinating. I watched a documentary recently, and I'd heard about it, but I never really digested it particularly, about the use of drugs in World War II in the military, including Hitler, incidentally. There was a very popular amphetamine in essentially a speed, right? In Germany in World War II, which you could just buy over the counter, but it was just like fed to the military. And when they did things like blitzkrieg early on, which is what why Hitler made all those incredible advances into Europe, it was because the tank commanders, they would just juice them up on speed, and these guys would go for like days without sleep, and it just became as natural as having a coffee. It wasn't thought to be like today if somebody was saying, okay, go and take some amphetamines, like it'd be like, why do you but apparently, while it was wonderful at the beginning of the war, later on, like during some of the African campaigns and the like, while the British would be able to go to sleep, during, certain times, and they'd be able to wind down, the Germans were so juiced up all the time. The tank commanders, again, it was often given to tank commanders. They never could rest, because you can't just say, okay, I won't take a pill today, because you're so juiced up, it takes days to, wind down and get off it. But it was fascinating how that doesn't say that the ideology of Nazi Germany wasn't, wicked and everything else. And it was not an excuse for what was happening, but it's so interesting that apparently and I can't even remember the name of the drug. It was like Percodan or no, that's a real drug here now. It had some name like Percocet or something. I can't remember, but it was literally like just the drug of Nazi Germany. And they would just dole it out. They'd have little canisters. They still had historically, people would just carry it in their pocket And so
Wow.
much of the early success was because of it, and much of the later inability to
They were
deal
like
with stuff was
drugged
because
up
of it.
super soldiers.
Yeah, literally, it was like they talk
Well,
about
do you
Captain
know what
America being a
happened?
super soldier, but
So
these guys literally
I'm
were.
going to tell you something that my client, who was the German, he would have been a Hitler's Youth, maybe not heavy. And when I was taking care of him, he told me, "Oh, the Allies, they bombed our pharmaceutical companies, blew up. We used to always have aspirin and these other stuff, and they bombed our pharmaceutical companies. So maybe they knew that these guys were medding up, and they started targeting their, one of the things you would target is someone's medical companies or factories or anything like that. So they were the Allies were targeting those companies. So it's funny that you say that they were that, but I believe that maybe they, as the war went on, they just didn't have the ability to make a lot of things
That's
because of the
possible
destruction.
too. Yeah, that's quite possible
Yeah,
too.
because I remember him telling me how they bombed their aspirin factory that made aspirin, and no one could get aspirin, and I was giving him Tylenol, and he says aspirin's better. That's what it was about. It was interesting, but totally off UFOs. But I mean, you can kind of see how almost all of these films, and you got to wonder though, because some of the films may not even be successful. I mean, Top Gun was, they hit a right note. It's like,
Mhm.
okay, they might make a film that actually might flop, so there's no guarantee necessarily that their objective will work. I guess they just have to have really good campaigning and read their audience really well and get that. I guess they have to know the psychology to get it right so that people will engage in their films and
Mm.
really believe the narrative. Like, it gets into the psyche, especially young people don't even know. My son, he's totally oblivious when he's doing video games and he has no idea he's being manipulated. Neither did I at that age. I probably was more aware, but because I grew up with a childhood with no TV and hardly any movies. When I was really young, I just didn't
Oh,
have
okay.
it. We didn't have a lot of money. But my son, they're inundated. And we complain I see a lot of comments where people are complaining about soy boys and all this technology, but hey, you know what? We are buying it for them. We're
Yeah,
hooking the internet up. We're engaging with it too. They're just young. So it's easy to get them hooked faster than
yeah.
us. So we're
I
kind of
can't.
partly to blame.
Yeah,
I
I
take
think
part of the blame.
I think most of the parents are. Jerry Cthulhu just said Pervitin. That's the name of it. Thank you, Jerry. The drug that the Nazis were popping like Tic Tacs. But I'll be honest. My daughter, I don't let her have any devices. She doesn't play any video
Mhm.
games, and as a result, she's still like a child of the '70s. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
She's not interested in modern crazy things. She's still. And I also homeschool her, which is awesome because she has friends.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
go to a once a week homeschool group, so she interacts with children and things. Like, she has, I think, a very healthy, balanced life, but she's not subjected to this. She doesn't have to be plugged in all the time. I mean, she would rather run
Yeah.
around outside and, play with our chickens or go for a walk in the woods or tell a story or build animals out of
That's
pipe cleaners or search for
yeah.
birds and look in
That's
her bird book and work out what they are. I mean, that's like there's
that's exactly what I used to do with my son when he was younger, but once he got older, it got harder and harder. But
because of the culture, you
yeah.
can't. And that's why I
Yeah.
homeschool, because I know no matter how good I am at home. I know when I was a kid, I loved my family, but as soon as I was immersed in a high school culture, my friends meant more to me than my family. They did. I mean,
Which
I'm
is
ashamed a little
normal.
bit to say it, but yeah, they meant much more to me. Like, I didn't care if I saw my family ever. I wanted to see my friends though.
My son's that way, and I was that way. I don't take it personal. They have to go form their own identity. Fortunately, he's got good friends who are into education, and he's not like the party ones who are like, ugh. There's some of the kids that he used to be friends with when he was little that are all about partying, drinking, and drugs, and he just fell out with them about, by the time he was in grade 6, 7, I was like, whew. He's pretty motivated, but it's, we'll probably tie this up a little bit. We're close to an hour and 20, and you
Sure.
thought you could only talk for 25 minutes.
I
That
thought no,
shows you.
I thought just on the CIA and UFO.
We
Well, I
can
could
just
talk about the CIA
go.
and UFOs for an hour, but just on the Hollywood connection, I only had a few examples. A lot of it's
Mhm,
just
mhm.
speculative, but we hit the few
Speculative.
examples I had. Yeah. So
Well, I have no doubt because of the CIA having this big budget. And I mean, we could go on with Al Mossad, but there's no doubt that Hollywood has the most provocative, it's got the most smooth campaigning. It's done the best, in my opinion, propaganda for decades and decades and decades. And it's only gotten smoother, slicker, and better, since silent films. And I'm assuming that, once the government and agencies like CIA saw Hollywood evolving, they knew, and same with TV, and it's in our home, they knew the potential and how valuable it was. So do you have
There's no doubt.
any last things that you want to kind of say that we've missed out or we haven't touched on the CIA, Hollywood, or any kind of intelligence and propaganda concerning either UFOs or outside or more general?
Well, I mean, concerning UFOs, I would be very reluctant for to believe any official proclamation when it came down. If all of a sudden, if tomorrow there was an official announcement, well, we have a crash saucer and we know the ETs are real, or I would totally think I was being lied to, for the simple reason that I think we've always been lied to about UFOs. If the government all of a sudden came out, and incidentally, when I say lied to, I think manipulated might be a more accurate term rather than lied to, because lied to seems like I'm paranoid and I don't trust anything. I just think that there's been a manipulation around the UFO subject, both via Hollywood and not always even intentional. I think the UFO phenomenon, and this is perhaps the best wrap up, I think the whole UFO phenomenon you can't understand if you don't understand that it's just embedded in deception on all kinds of levels, from the type of things we've talked about through, actual perhaps manipulation of popular culture, to the ideas we've talked about disclosure seeming to be very well controlled and engineered, but to other things as well, to perhaps when we were talking briefly, we mentioned Greg Bishop's article on co-creation. And I think that feeds into things people before him had talked about, like Jacques Vallée and John Keel, that maybe whatever the external is somehow playing on our expectations, and at both cultural or religious or social or whatever, what we think we're going to see when we encounter something strange. And maybe in a way, so maybe we're deceiving ourselves. So I don't think you can understand the UFO phenomenon at all unless you understand that it's so shrouded in shadow and weirdness and deception and sometimes intentional lies, sometimes even unconscious ones that we tell ourselves. So whatever your preconceptions about UFOs are, I think it's always worth checking and always thinking, this is an area nobody really knows. And maybe the US government don't even know. Maybe they know they're flying some state-of-the-art machine and they're used a spin story to make you think it's a flying saucer because it works for them. But maybe the deeper kind of mystery about encounters with non-human beings and weirdness, maybe nobody knows that. And I think we continue to deceive ourselves when we think, oh, I've read this book which told me they're from Zeta Reticuli, or I've read this book which tells me they're friendly Venusians, or whatever. We can deceive ourselves as well. So the UFO topic, whether we're being lied to in a film which has intentionally been manipulated by an intelligence agency, or whether we're just believing, what our eyes even tell us, perhaps, even maybe they're deceiving you. Maybe if you have an encounter with something weird tonight, maybe your preconceptions are deceiving you. Who knows? So yeah, I think just be aware that maybe nothing is the way you think it is when it comes to this topic.
So I like this comment we have from Big Rolling Home, and I've often thought this, and he says, I have it up on the screen there, Hollywood movies have attempted to imprint a response into our psyche. If something happens, we are trained to react in a Hollywood way.
Great
and
point.
I think that's a really important statement, because we are, before movies and films, maybe we might have seen a play or something, loose play, but we have been trained to view life as a movie, I think. And before,
Absolutely.
long time ago, no one would have thought of life that way. We're also trained about propaganda as ourselves as a brand, weight. Like, we see all these thin, perfect Hollywood specimens, and our minds have been totally effed with. We have no concept, I think, of what it would be to be somebody without that narrative.
For sure.
It's so powerful.
Well,
And same with the
culture is
UFO
powerful.
narrative.
Yeah, culture
Yeah.
is powerful. Culture is more powerful than politics. Like, if you could control the culture or you could control the politics, you'd have to be silly to want to control the politics, because the culture underpins everything. And today we live in a culture for better or worse, I would say for worse, which is a mass culture, which is produced usually in cities on either coast, which has very little to do with traditional folk type cultures, which kind of came from the ground up, which were based upon the seasons or based upon, your local community, or were based upon, things your forefathers believed. Today, the culture is produced by a very small
Corporations
cadre,
and
really,
movies.
of people working in entertainment, whether it's media, or whether it's news, or whether it's film, or whether it's television or music. That's the culture today. But they're not.
Yeah.
It's not a base. It's not a culture growing out of the roots. It's a culture fabricated and just
Yes.
pumped into us.
Yeah, it's not the family, the whole community. It's literally our culture is being pumped out by massive corporations on
Yeah,
every level.
absolutely. It's a corporate culture, and people just
Woo-wee!
suck it down.
That's so depressing. Well, Dean, I want to thank you for showing up and having that intense conversation. And I guess every time we look outside now, we'll realize, wow, we are just a product of massive corporation thought. Yikes.
Unfortunately. But thank you for having me. It's always so
Well,
much fun to talk to you, Melissa. I really enjoyed it.
no worries. I'll be right there. I'm going to tie up the show. Guys, thank you so much for joining. You guys can check out Dean's website. He has it at www.midwestweirdfest.com. If you go to /talkingweird, that will take you to Dean's podcast. He does have a podcast called Talking Weird. It's really good. He has amazing guests on there. So please check that out. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our Rumble channel. It was a little messed up on the stream. I forgot to hook it up, but it's streaming there now. It's Gen X on X down at Rumble. Of course, go to the website. It's genxnewsx.com. All the links, everything is there, including the Ghostly Archives, the Beast System, and Gen X News. All the shows are there. And of course, you please subscribe, please share, please like, please support the show by that. And if you're listening to this on audio, 5 stars helps us show up. All right. So everybody, I want to thank you guys for showing up. It's a great topic. Just shows us how heavily we are manipulated. And it's kind of sad. I feel like going out and doing yard work or hiding in a cave. Oh my goodness. Anyways, tomorrow I'm on with the Beast System with Emily. We're talking about Clowns and the Nephilim Part 2. There isn't going to be a Tinfoil Hat Friday, but I am going to be possibly appearing on Emily's show, the What the Frick Live, as a guest host if she needs be. So if she does, I'll have the links up and you guys can check that out as well. Thanks so much, guys, and I'm going to shut her down.